The envelope arrived on a Tuesday morning, its official letterhead stark against the chaos of Maria Santos's kitchen table. Bills scattered like fallen leaves. Medical prescriptions forming small mountains beside her morning coffee. The hurricane had been 3 months ago, but the aftermath still clung to everything like humidity after a storm. She opened the envelope with trembling fingers, her arthritis protesting the simple motion. Emergency Recovery Tax Assessment, $447.50, due within 30 days. Maria stared at the numbers until they blurred. Her disability check barely covered rent and medication. The hurricane had destroyed her small garden, her only source of fresh vegetables. Now this. She reached for her phone with shaking hands, dialing her neighbor Mrs. Johnson across the street. Doris, did you get a tax bill today from the HOA? What tax bill? Honey, I didn't get nothing like that. Maria's stomach dropped. Mrs. Johnson lived in an identical unit, had the same roof damage, the same broken fence, the same everything except the color of her skin. Maria hung up and called her nephew Carlos, her voice barely above a whisper. Carlos, mijo, I need you to come over. Something's not right. 20 minutes later, Carlos stood in her doorway, his construction boots muddy from the job site. He'd been working double shifts since the hurricane, helping rebuild the neighborhood one house at a time. His calloused hands held the tax bill like it might bite him. This is wrong, Tia. This is completely wrong. But it's official. See the letterhead, the signature. Karen Mitchell, HOA President. Carlos's jaw tightened at the name. Karen Mitchell had been a thorn in the community's side for 2 years, ever since she'd moved into the largest house on Maple Street. She'd campaigned for HOA President on a platform of neighborhood improvement and property value enhancement. What she delivered was a steady stream of complaints, fines, and regulations that seemed to target specific families. I'm going to make some calls. Tia, this isn't legal. It can't be. But as Carlos drove through the neighborhood that afternoon, a pattern emerged that made his blood run cold. Every house with a black family had received the emergency tax bill. Every house with a disabled resident had received it. The Washingtons, who'd lived here for 15 years. The Garcias, whose son Miguel used a wheelchair. The elderly Mr. Thompson, whose Parkinson's had worsened since his wife's death. None of the white families had received bills. Not one. Carlos parked outside the community center, his hands gripping the steering wheel until his knuckles turned white. The building looked peaceful in the afternoon sun, its brick facade warm and welcoming. Inside, Karen Mitchell held court every Tuesday, conducting HOA business with the efficiency of a small-town dictator. The meeting room smelled of cheap coffee and industrial carpet. Karen sat at the head of a folding table, her blonde hair pulled back in a severe bun, her clothes expensive but somehow cold. She looked up as Carlos entered, her smile thin and practiced. Mr. Santos, how nice to see you. Are you here about your aunt's assessment? I'm here about the illegal tax you're trying to collect from vulnerable residents. Karen's smile never wavered. She shuffled through a stack of papers with deliberate slowness, her manicured nails clicking against the table. The emergency recovery tax is perfectly legal, authorized by the HOA covenant. We need funds for neighborhood repairs after the hurricane damage. Then why didn't everyone get a bill? Why just the black families? Why just the disabled residents? I'm sure I don't know what you're implying, Mr. Santos. The assessment was based on careful evaluation of each property's needs and the owner's ability to contribute to community recovery. The euphemism hung in the air like smoke. Carlos felt his temperature rising, but he kept his voice steady. Show me the evaluation criteria. Show me the documentation that justifies these specific assessments. Karen's eyes narrowed slightly. For a moment, the mask slipped, revealing something harder underneath. The HOA board makes decisions based on what's best for the entire community. If certain residents have concerns about their assessments, they can file an appeal through proper channels. What proper channels? You're the HOA president, secretary, and treasurer. You are the proper channels. I think this conversation is over. Mr. Santos, the bills have been sent. The deadline is clear. I suggest your aunt pay promptly to avoid additional penalties. Carlos left the community center with a fire in his chest and a plan forming in his mind. He spent the evening visiting every family who'd received a bill, documenting their stories, their struggles, their fears. By midnight, he had a list of 23 families, all fitting the same profile. The next morning, he drove to the county courthouse. The records office was a maze of filing cabinets and computer terminals, staffed by a tired-looking clerk named Janet, who'd been there since the Carter administration. I need to see the HOA filing documents for Sunset Garden subdivision, specifically any amendments or emergency powers provisions. Janet disappeared into the back room, returning with a thick folder that smelled of dust and age. Carlos spread the documents across a table, his finger tracing through dense legal language. What he found made his heart sink. The HOA covenant did include emergency assessment powers, but buried in subsection 4.7.3 was a clause that seemed to give the board broad discretion in determining assessment amounts based on community impact factors and resident contribution capacity. It was vague enough to be legal, specific enough to be weaponized. Carlos photographed every page, his mind racing. Legal didn't mean right. Legal didn't mean just, and sometimes, legal didn't mean it would hold up under scrutiny. That evening, he called a meeting at his aunt's house. 23 families crowded into her small living room, spilling out onto the back patio. The air was thick with anger and fear, voices overlapping in Spanish and English, children playing at their parents' feet despite the tension. Mrs. Washington, a retired teacher whose husband had died in Vietnam, spoke first. Her voice was steady, but her hands shook as she held her bill. I've lived in this neighborhood for 15 years. I've paid every assessment, followed every rule. Now they want almost $5,000 I don't have for repairs that should have been done years ago. Miguel Garcia, the young man in the wheelchair, rolled forward. His voice carried the weight of someone who'd fought battles his whole life. This isn't about hurricane repair. This is about pushing us out, making life so expensive we have to leave. An elderly woman named Rosa Martinez stood up slowly, her walker creaking. She'd been quiet until now, but her words carried the authority of someone who'd survived decades of struggle. In my country, we had a word for people like Karen Mitchell, caciques, little dictators who use their power to hurt people they don't like. We didn't run from them there, and we won't run from her here. The room erupted in agreement, voices rising in a mix of languages and emotions. Carlos held up his hand for quiet. Here's what we're going to do. We're going to document everything, every interaction, every threat, every deadline. We're going to request a full accounting of HOA funds. And we're going to demand a community meeting where everyone can see what's really happening. The plan took shape over the following weeks. Carlos organized teams to canvass the neighborhood, documenting the disparity in assessments, Maria, despite her arthritis, became the unofficial record keeper. Her kitchen table transformed into a command center covered with receipts, photos, and testimonies. The first breakthrough came from an unexpected source. Tommy Chen, a computer programmer who lived in the affluent section of the neighborhood, knocked on Carlos's door on a Thursday evening. He was nervous, glancing over his shoulder as if someone might be watching. "I heard what's happening with the tax bills. I didn't get one, but I should have. My roof was destroyed. My fence is still down. I want to know why." Carlos invited him in, spreading the documentation across his dining table. Tommy's eyes widened as he saw the pattern. "This is discrimination, clear as day. But you need more than documentation. You need to follow the money." "What do you mean?" HOA finances are supposed to be transparent. Bank statements, expenditure reports, contractor payments. If Karen's claiming this money is for repairs, she has to show where it's going. Tommy's suggestion opened a new front in their investigation. Under HOA law, residents had the right to request financial records. Carlos drafted a formal letter, signed by all 23 affected families, demanding a full accounting of HOA funds for the past 2 years. Karen's response came within days, delivered by certified mail. The letter was brief and dismissive, claiming that financial records were proprietary information, available only to board members, and that the request was vexatious and potentially libelous. But the letter contained a mistake that changed everything. In her haste to reject the request, Karen had referenced ongoing repair contracts with MKC Construction and emergency storm damage remediation by Mitchell Property Services. Carlos read the letter 3 times before the significance hit him. Mitchell Property Services. Karen's last name was Mitchell. The next morning, he drove to the county business licensing office. The clerk, a young woman named Sandra, was more helpful than he'd expected. Mitchell Property Services. "Yeah, I remember that application. Filed about 6 months ago. Owner is Karen Mitchell. Same address as... Wait, this is interesting." "What's interesting?" "The business license lists the company as sole proprietorship, emergency property repair services. But there's no contractor's license on file. You need a contractor's license to do the kind of work she's claiming." Carlos felt his pulse quicken. An unlicensed contractor billing the HOA for emergency repairs. It was starting to look like more than discrimination. It was starting to look like fraud. Armed with this new information, Carlos contacted the state attorney general's office. The receptionist transferred him to a young prosecutor named David Kim, who specialized in HOA disputes. "Mr. Santos, what you're describing could constitute several violations of state law. But I need more than suspicion. I need documentation, evidence, witnesses." "What kind of evidence?" "Financial records showing misappropriation of funds. Proof that the assessed residents are being treated differently than others. Documentation of the actual repair work claimed in the assessments." The conversation gave Carlos a roadmap, but also a sobering reality. Legal action would take months, maybe years. The families who'd received bills couldn't wait that long. That evening, Maria called him with news that made his blood run cold. "Carlos, she sent letters to everyone who got bills. If we don't pay by Friday, she's putting liens on our properties. We could lose our homes." The lien threat was the escalation Carlos had feared. Karen was moving quickly, probably hoping to force payment before anyone could mount an effective challenge. But it was also a mistake. The threat was so clearly retaliatory that it might finally provide the legal opening they needed. Carlos called an emergency meeting for that night. The community center was packed, families sitting on folding chairs and standing along the walls. The air buzzed with tension and fear. Karen Mitchell entered the room like she owned it, her heels clicking against the linoleum floor. She was followed by a thin man in an expensive suit, who Carlos assumed was her lawyer. "I understand there are questions about the emergency assessment. I'm here to clarify the situation and, hopefully, resolve any misunderstandings." Mrs. Washington stood up, her voice carrying the authority of her former classroom. "The misunderstanding is why my family got a bill for $5,000, while the Johnsons, who have the same damage, got nothing. The assessment was based on careful evaluation of each property's contribution to community storm damage and the residents' historical participation in neighborhood improvement projects." The euphemism was even more elaborate this time, but the meaning was clear. Carlos stood up, his voice cutting through the room. "Show us the evaluation criteria. Show us the documentation. Show us where the money's going." Karen's lawyer leaned forward, his voice professionally cold. "The HOA board has broad discretion in emergency situations. The assessment is legal and binding. Failure to pay will result in liens against the properties." "And what happens after the liens?" "Foreclosure proceedings, if necessary." The word hung in the air like a death sentence. Several families had children who started crying at the tension in the room. Carlos felt the weight of their fear, but also their determination. "You want to foreclose on families who've lost everything in a hurricane? You want to throw disabled residents out of their homes? We want to collect legitimate assessments for community improvements. If residents can't afford to maintain their properties, perhaps they should consider other housing options." The mask was off now. Karen's true intentions were clear, spoken aloud in front of dozens of witnesses. But Carlos also noticed something else. The lawyer looked uncomfortable, shifting in his seat as if he was just now understanding what he'd been hired to defend. Miguel Garcia rolled his wheelchair forward, his voice steady despite the chaos around him. "I've been researching HOA law since this started. You can't assess individual families different amounts for the same damage. You can't target residents based on protected characteristics. And you definitely can't use HOA funds to pay your own construction company." The room went silent. Karen's face flushed red, but her lawyer grabbed her arm before she could speak. "That's a serious accusation. Mr. Garcia, do you have proof of these claims?" Miguel smiled, reaching into his backpack. He pulled out a folder, thick with documents. "Mitchell Property Services, sole proprietorship. Owner Karen Mitchell, no contractor's license. 3 invoices to the HOA, totaling $47,000 for emergency storm damage repair. Work that was never done." The lawyer's face went pale. He whispered something to Karen, who shook her head violently. But the damage was done. The room erupted in angry voices, families demanding answers, children crying at the shouting. Carlos held up his hand for quiet, his voice cutting through the chaos. "Mrs. Mitchell, you've been billing the HOA for repair work that was never done. You've been using those fake invoices to justify discriminatory assessments against minority and disabled residents. That's not just HOA abuse. That's fraud." Karen stood up abruptly, her chair scraping against the floor. "This meeting is over. You'll be hearing from our attorneys." She stormed out, her lawyer following with an expression of growing concern. But the families remained, their fear transforming into something more powerful collective determination. The next morning, Carlos drove to the state capitol. The Attorney General's office was the imposing building of glass and steel. But Prosecutor David Kim's office was surprisingly modest, filled with case files and legal textbooks. Mr. Santos, what you've brought me is significant. If we can prove that Mitchell created false invoices to justify discriminatory assessments, we're looking at criminal charges. What do you need from us? Access to the HOA bank records, documentation of the repair work that was supposedly done, testimony from the affected families. And how long will this take? Weeks, maybe months, but I can get a temporary restraining order to stop the lien process while we investigate. The restraining order was a lifeline, but Carlos knew Karen wouldn't give up easily. She had too much at stake, too much to lose if the truth came out. The counterattack came 2 days later. Carlos arrived at work to find his boss, a nervous man named Frank, waiting by his truck. Carlos, I got a call about you. Someone saying you're harassing residents, making threats. I can't have that kind of trouble on my jobs. Frank, you know me. I've worked for you for 3 years. When have I ever caused trouble? I know. But this lady, she sounded official, said she was from the neighborhood association, had documentation of complaints. Carlos felt his stomach drop. Karen was going after his livelihood, trying to isolate him from the community support he'd built. But Frank was a good man, fair, if not particularly brave. Frank, give me a week. Let me show you what's really happening. Then you can decide. That evening, Carlos called an emergency meeting of the affected families. The pattern was becoming clear. Karen was pressuring employers, landlords, anyone with economic power over the families who'd received bills. Mrs. Washington had been told her part-time job at the library might be eliminated due to budget concerns. Miguel Garcia had received a notice that his disability parking space was being revoked for administrative review. Even elderly Mr. Thompson had been informed that his home health care aide was under investigation for unauthorized activities. The pressure campaign was systematic and cruel, but it was also desperate. Karen was making moves that would leave evidence, creating a paper trail of retaliation that would be hard to explain in court. The breakthrough came from an unexpected source. Tommy Chen, the computer programmer who'd first suggested following the money, knocked on Carlos's door on a Thursday evening with a laptop bag slung over his shoulder. I've been thinking about what you said, about the fake invoices and the repair work that was never done. I want to help. How? I'm good with computers, really good. And I know how to trace digital financial records. Tommy explained that modern financial transactions left digital fingerprints that were almost impossible to erase. Bank transfers, invoice payments, even email communications were stored on servers that could be subpoenaed. But we need legal authority to access those records. We need someone with subpoena power. Carlos thought about Prosecutor David Kim, but also about someone with even more authority. Someone who could move fast when the situation demanded it. The next morning, he drove to the governor's office. The building was a fortress of marble and security. But Carlos had an appointment with Sarah Rodriguez, the governor's liaison for community affairs. Mr. Santos, I've reviewed the materials you sent. If these allegations are true, we're looking at a serious abuse of power that affects some of our most vulnerable residents. What can the governor do? Emergency audit of the HOA finances, criminal investigation by the state police, and immediate suspension of any lien or foreclosure proceedings. The words were like water in a desert. Carlos felt hope for the first time in weeks. "What do you need from us?" "Everything you have. Documentation, testimonies, financial records, and we'll need the affected families to cooperate with the investigation." Carlos left the governor's office with a new sense of purpose. The machinery of justice was finally beginning to turn. But he knew Karen wouldn't go down without a fight. The state audit team arrived on a Monday morning. 3 serious-looking officials with briefcases and subpoena power. They set up in the community center, the same room where Karen had dismissed the family's concerns just weeks earlier. Carlos watched from across the street as Karen arrived with her lawyer and a new face. A woman in an expensive suit who looked like she specialized in crisis management. They disappeared into the building for 6 hours. When they emerged, Karen's face was pale. Her usual composure cracked. The lawyer was on his phone, speaking in urgent whispers. The crisis management specialist was already distancing herself, walking quickly to her car without looking back. The audit results were devastating. Mitchell Property Services had billed the HOA for $47,000 in repair work that was never done. The invoices were elaborate fakes, complete with fabricated work orders and false completion reports. The money had been transferred to Karen's personal accounts, then used to pay for luxury vacations, expensive clothes, and home improvements. But the financial fraud was only part of the story. The audit also revealed a pattern of discriminatory enforcement going back 2 years. Families of color were fined for minor violations that were ignored in white households. Disabled residents were subjected to harassment about accessibility modifications that were legally required. The smoking gun was found in Karen's email account. Messages to other board members discussing undesirable residents and strategies to encourage relocation of problem families. The language was careful, coded, but the intent was clear. Governor Patricia Williams called a press conference on a Thursday afternoon. The State House press room was packed with reporters, cameras, and microphones. Carlos sat in the front row with Maria, Mrs. Washington, and Miguel Garcia. Today, we announce criminal charges against Karen Mitchell, former president of the Sunset Gardens HOA, for fraud, embezzlement, and civil rights violations. The emergency assessments levied against minority and disabled residents were illegal, discriminatory, and based on fabricated expenses. The governor's voice was steady, but Carlos could hear the anger underneath. No resident should fear losing their home because of the color of their skin or their disability status. No HOA president should be able to use their position to line their own pockets while targeting vulnerable families. The questions from reporters were sharp, focused. How had this gone on for so long? What protections existed for other HOA residents? What would happen to the families who'd been victimized? All emergency assessments will be immediately refunded with interest. The HOA board will be disbanded and replaced with a court-appointed administrator. And we're proposing new legislation to prevent this kind of abuse in the future. After the press conference, Carlos found himself surrounded by reporters, microphones thrust toward his face. The questions came fast and overlapping. "Mr. Santos, how does it feel to see justice served? What would you say to other communities facing similar abuse? Do you think this case will change how HOAs operate?" Carlos looked around the room, at Maria smiling through tears, at Mrs. Washington standing straight with dignity, at Miguel Garcia recording everything on his phone to share with the community. This was never about one bad HOA president. This was about a community that refused to be divided, refused to be intimidated, refused to accept injustice. We stood together, and we won together. The trial took place 6 months later in the county courthouse. Karen Mitchell had hired a team of expensive lawyers. But the evidence was overwhelming. The fake invoices, the discriminatory emails, the financial records showing embezzlement. Her defense team tried to claim the assessments were legitimate, based on complex property evaluations. But the prosecution methodically dismantled each argument. Carlos testified on the second day, his voice steady as he described the pattern of discrimination, the fear in his aunt's eyes, the determination of families who had lost everything but still found the strength to fight back. Maria testified from a wheelchair, her arthritis making it difficult to stand for long periods. But her voice was strong as she described the impact of the bogus tax bill on her life, her health, her sense of security in her own home. I came to this country looking for opportunity, for fairness. I worked hard, paid my taxes, followed the rules. But Mrs. Mitchell tried to take away my home because of who I am, not because of what I did. The jury deliberated for 3 hours. When they returned, the forewoman stood and read the verdict in a clear voice that carried throughout the packed courtroom. On the charge of fraud in the first degree, we find the defendant guilty. On the charge of embezzlement, we find the defendant guilty. On the charge of civil rights violations, we find the defendant guilty. Karen Mitchell was sentenced to 5 years in prison and ordered to pay $150,000 in restitution to the affected families. The judge's words were stern and clear. Ms. Mitchell, you abused a position of trust to target vulnerable residents for your own financial gain. You used discrimination as a weapon and greed as a guide. Your actions have no place in a just society. Outside the courthouse, the families gathered in a circle, their faces reflecting a mixture of relief, exhaustion, and quiet triumph. Children played on the courthouse steps, while their parents talked in low voices about the future. Carlos looked around at the group. These people who had become more than neighbors, more than allies. They had become family, bound together by shared struggle and mutual support. So what now? The question came from Miguel Garcia, but it was on everyone's mind. The fight was over. Justice had been served. But the work of rebuilding their community was just beginning. Mrs. Washington, now serving as the interim HOA president, smiled with the wisdom of someone who had seen many battles. Now we go home. We plant gardens. We help our neighbors. We make sure this never happens again. The new HOA board was elected 3 months later in a community center packed with residents of all backgrounds. The bylaws were rewritten with input from civil rights lawyers, creating transparency requirements and anti-discrimination protections. The emergency assessment power was eliminated entirely. Maria's garden was the first to bloom that spring. She had replanted it with help from neighbors. The soil enriched by compost from the community garden project that had grown out of their shared struggle. Her tomatoes were prize-winning, her peppers legendary, her hospitality unmatched. Carlos still worked construction, but now he also served on the HOA board's oversight committee, helping to ensure that the financial transparency they had fought for remained in place. He kept a framed photo of the press conference on his desk, a reminder of what was possible when people stood together. The neighborhood looked different now, not just because of the new construction and repaired roofs, but because of the relationships that had been forged in the fire of shared adversity. Block parties happened regularly. Children played in yards that had once been divided by suspicion. The community center hosted ESL classes, disability rights workshops, and monthly potluck dinners where stories were shared in multiple languages. Tommy Chen, the computer programmer who had helped trace the financial fraud, started a nonprofit organization dedicated to helping HOA residents understand their rights and protect themselves from abuse. The organization's first office was in the Sunset Gardens Community Center, its walls covered with photos of successful cases and grateful families. On the first anniversary of the press conference, the governor returned to Sunset Gardens for a celebration. The community center was decorated with balloons and banners, tables groaning under the weight of dishes, representing dozens of cultural traditions. In her speech, Governor Williams reflected on the broader significance of what had happened. What we saw here was not just the correction of an injustice, but the demonstration of what's possible when communities refuse to be divided, when neighbors stand with neighbors, when people choose courage over comfort, truth over silence. As the celebration continued into the evening, Carlos found himself standing in the parking lot with his Aunt Maria, watching children play under the streetlights. The hurricane damage was long repaired, but the scars of that struggle had become sources of strength. "Mijo, do you think it was worth it? All the worry, all the fear, all the fighting." Carlos looked at the community center, bright with lights and laughter, filled with people who had learned to trust each other through trial and triumph. "Tia, look around. Look at what we built. Not just the repairs, but the relationships, the trust, the hope. Yes, it was worth it." Maria nodded, her eyes bright with unshed tears. She had lived through many struggles, in many countries, but she had never seen a community transform itself so completely, so courageously. "Your uncle would be proud. He always said that democracy is not something you inherit. It's something you create, every day, with every choice." As they walked back toward the celebration, Carlos reflected on the lessons of the past year. Justice was not automatic. It was earned through persistence and courage. Community was not given. It was built through shared struggle and mutual support. And hope was not a luxury. It was a necessity, the fuel that powered every step toward a better future. The music from the community center drifted across the parking lot, a blend of salsa and country, hip-hop and classical, reflecting the beautiful diversity of voices that had found harmony in their common cause. The sound carried on the evening breeze, a testament to the power of ordinary people to create extraordinary change. One conversation, one relationship, one act of courage at a time. In the months that followed, the Sunset Gardens model spread to other communities, other states, other struggles. The legislation inspired by their case became law, providing new protections for HOA residents and requirements for financial transparency. The non-profit organization grew, helping thousands of families understand their rights and organize for justice. But perhaps the most important legacy was harder to measure. Written not in law books, but in the hearts and minds of people who had learned that they were not powerless, that their voices mattered, that their community was worth fighting for. It was a lesson that would echo through generations, a reminder that even in the darkest times, hope could take root and grow into something beautiful, something lasting, something that could light the way for others still searching for their own path to justice. The story of Sunset Gardens became more than a local victory. It became a symbol of what was possible when people refused to accept injustice, when neighbors stood with neighbors, when the most vulnerable members of a community were protected and empowered. And in a world that often seemed divided by difference, it offered a different vision, one where diversity was celebrated, where everyone had a voice, where home was not just a place, but a promise of dignity, respect, and belonging for all.